Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulence. It's hard to disentangle them sometimes. Climatic, geopolitical, in the United States, political. We have climate change, we have climate vulnerability, creating immense turbulence in places like Los Angeles, and so much more. And there's always the prospect of another pandemic just waiting around the corner. We'll see how this all unfolds. And it's great to be finally on screen here on Sustain What with Michael Liebreich, who I've been following for many years for his wisdom and also his edge. He's not afraid to dive into arguments around some of the tough issues of our time related to climate change. What's real, what's not real, what makes a difference moving toward a clean energy landscape around the world. And it's just great to have you on here finally on Sustain What to talk through some of this. We'll focus on some of the big picture words like net zero and even energy transition. But I wanted to start just basically by, for those who are not familiar with your work, and my blog and my effort is more general. It's about the full sustainability question. What the hell got you into this mess? Why climate? Why clean energy? Why? There's so many other things you could do with your talents in engineering and finance and all the rest.
Andy, first of all, it's a great honor and a pleasure to be on this show with you. There was a risk there that we would descend into a kind of mutual fan club. So the answer to that, I wish I could say that, when I grew up, I wanted to do my bit for the planet and sustainability. And I understood very early on that climate change was the existential challenge. And I decided to do, that's why I went to engineering school. And that's why I spent so much time in the mountains. And that's why I spent so much time in factories. And that's why it's not like that at all. I started New Energy Finance when I was 41. So, but what it did is it drew together, I guess, Steve Jobs talks about how you can only join the dots looking back. And, I was interested in engineering, and I am interested or was interested all along in energy. And I did spend, I'm not an environmentalist. I spent a lot of time outdoors, skiing and climbing and so on. And I'm very interested in geopolitics. I'm very interested in the sort of systems of systems thinking. I didn't gel with economics, but once you get into kind of evolutionary economics, that resonates. So I had all these things going on that then came together when I founded New Energy Finance, the information provider, which I grew very rapidly for 5 years and then sold to Mike Bloomberg. And I've really just, once you are deeply exposed to this issue set and how central it is to everything, the economy, human experience, the planet, whatever, it's very difficult then to say, right, I've sold a business, I'm going to go back to, designing computer games or, working on travel tech or whatever it is. It's very difficult to do that. Once you're in, you're kind of in, I think.
And New Energy Finance, I think I met you first at some conference in New York City where you were a BNEF, you were on stage, and I was impressed with your candor sometimes in terms of, quite often these arenas, especially in finance, are laden with simplified, gushy enthusiasm. And you were saying some things, this is at least 10, 12 years ago, I don't know, maybe longer, that I thought were refreshing. Do you find joy in being prickly and honest? Or you're in a universe where there's a lot of greenwashing and the like, so how does that work?
Well, I don't know if I take joy in being prickly. I take joy in being me, if I'm honest. And I think that, you reach a certain point in your life where you really kind of, who you are. And what I would say is that, I've been in situations, I've been in industries, I was at McKinsey where, you weigh everything you say because you've got multiple audiences. You've got the kind of maybe the team you're working with, and then you have to be honest because you're working too hard and you know them really well. You've got the client, you've got the seniors, the overhead who are evaluating whether you do or don't get a promotion. And then you go home and you've got your family and you're juggling this. And for me, that created, I will be honest, a lot of stress, a lot of mental anguish about living different lives in different situations. Not helped by the fact that part of the year I was off skiing, competing internationally, and part of the year I was at McKinsey, pretending that was the only thing I cared about in the world, because that's what you had to do to get ahead. And once I got into new energy finance, everything became a lot simpler. I have one way to talk about these issues with my kids, with my wife, with my colleagues, with my clients, with this audience. And if they don't like it, there are other people they can listen to, and they can either get more value if that's what they think, or less value. But I don't have to make those compromises. And yeah, I do enjoy a little bit of the sort of flamboyance, the performative nature. I mean, you've just popped on the screen there. There's a picture of me skiing, but how can I put it? Not quietly and calmly, right? That's showing off. So there's a part of me that enjoys. I like being the center of attention. I got something to say, I'm going to say it. So why not? And so I don't know if being prickly is kind of, I don't know if that's part of it or not. That's where I've ended up.
Yeah. So now, once you got onto the slope, what were some of the points when you realized that this arena that you got into, that the slope you're skiing is more complicated than you might have thought? Was there a point like that, or did you always say, this is going to be super hard and divisive and complicated?
I think I've always thought it will be super hard. Well, in a way, the funny thing is super hard and super easy. So I was just very lucky early in my career. I calculated a bunch of learning curves. And so I did, other types of microeconomics, but I did do a lot of work. And I have great faith in human ability to innovate, and also just investment and scale, building infrastructure that has an impact on cost. So I started out really back at the beginning of the new energy finance journey saying, look, solar is like a flat screen TV, and wind is like, I don't know, a locomotive or a truck. These things just get cheaper and cheaper, some faster, some slower. And of course, batteries then came along. And I had been very exposed to digital technologies. I was deeply implicated in the dot-com boom bust cycle. And so I knew the accelerative impacts of digitization. And so there's a piece of it that has always been, I've always thought, look, it kind of doesn't matter what we do. We're going to go down that route. We can go faster, we can go slower, but it's not a mystery where we're going to end up. But then wrapped around that, there are societal issues, political issues, sort of tribalism. Of course, social media came along halfway through my new energy finance journey, in a sense. About 10 years ago, it started to become a dominating force in society, and that adds complications. And obviously, you have difficult sectors, I don't know, aviation or cement or whatever. And I didn't really think about those initially. I put those in a kind of, very hard bucket. But there's so much to do that's not that hard. And then about 2018, I shifted my focus to what were then called the hard to abate sectors, and spent a lot more time on them. So it's always been obvious that, I've already mentioned evolutionary economics. We're not going to solve this problem by sitting down, finding the solution, and spending 50 years executing. And do you remember something called was it the Sokolow wedges?
Oh, sure.
Right. And I was profoundly unimpressed with them. It was saying, well, to solve climate change, we need a wedge of energy efficiency, a wedge of nuclear, a wedge of renewables, a wedge of food and this is how much. The problem with that model was it assumed that this was 2004-5 that I was looking at this stuff, 2006, something like that. It assumed that you could kind of make a decision and then just execute a wedge. We're actually going to do rolling innovations that build on each other in a very, very different model. And so that was, it's a long answer to your question, but I never thought that rolling process was easy, but I never thought it would stop either.
Yeah. And one thing that I think a lot of climate policy and energy policy, and maybe finance too, misses is that the change is changing, meaning the pace of change, as you were saying with solar. I think one thing that I missed early on, I used to get punished by Joe Rahm when he was at the Center for American Progress for some things that I said, but I think he was right about the production efficiency, for example, driving prices down faster. Then it wasn't just about innovation. I was really focused. I wrote a page one story for the New York Times in 2006 on how declining research budgets for basic innovation science around energy were happening even as climate concerns are rising. And I was really focused on that gap and not so much on what could happen just by making more stuff. And I think you were on that boat as well.
Well, and I think that's, as I say, I had this great privilege or luck early in my career to calculate learning curves, and really quite deeply. So this was at Braxton Associates, which was a spin out of BCG. And so I've never fallen into the thinking that, it's going to come out of a lab. We just have to pour more money into labs and eventually something will pop out. And, that may work in, curing cancer. That might be the right model. But in energy and in anything to do with the environment, environmental problems are caused by physical things: our boilers, our cars, our homes, our roads, our cities, our trucks, our trains, our factories, the chimneys. So, nothing that happens in a lab is going to quickly and instantly transform that. This isn't,
Right.
It's not pharmaceuticals, and it's also not digital. Digital is a layer that can make things quicker. But, even if you have, we're probably going to get on to talk about AI. It'll help, but AI on what? It still has to be on an engine, on a valve, on something physical. And I had the luck to calculate that these physical things go down fairly predictable cost reductions, and you can bank on them. They're always, 20% cost reduction for every doubling of cumulative experience in human knowledge. But you also can't overtrade them, which is also an important point. That, you talked about me being perhaps edgy. There are some people who now want to say, well, wind got cheap, solar got cheap, batteries are getting cheaper, and AI is coming along, and therefore this will be easy. This is going to happen automatically. And anybody who disagrees sort of doesn't understand the laws of physics. And I push back on. So I sort of sit in the middle, almost like punching left and right, saying, you can bank on the learning curves, but you can't overbank on them. And obviously, lab innovation plays a role because it's way upstream from the learning curves, and it's feeding some of the breakthroughs that you need 5, 10, 15 years down the line in terms of, perovskites, or in terms of, whatever material innovation you want to, different catalysts and so on.
Right. And one thing, you're immersed in an arena that's clearly, you take the laboratory stuff and you have to link it with finance and link it with these other agencies, capacities. And I was talking a long time ago, with a guy named Andrew Hargadon, who studies innovation, like the science. He studies how innovation happens or doesn't happen. And so much of it was about linkages, getting like postdocs into a room with people who are in the investment community, so they understand the languages, and the different cultures get more comfortable. How much of the innovation that's needed is to build those conversations more? Like, if you could look at that pipeline from the aha moment on a new battery chemistry to having a battery power plant like the one in Moss Landing that doesn't catch fire, what would that look like? What have you learned about the dynamics that we aren't doing enough of that can make that all better?
So just on Moss Landing, a few years back, we took an Airbnb looking out over the beach, but it was actually within sight of that power plant. For those who are not, who are not aware, there's this vast plume of smoke coming up from a huge, colossal battery fire, and absolutely innovation in battery materials. But interestingly, they also took some risks building that battery, because they put a whole bunch of batteries into a building, not with air gaps. You can, if something is prone to burn, then don't put it all in one building, and also make different choices perhaps about what battery chemistries you use. So
Right.
there's innovation on the technology side, but also on the business building side. And I think, if you look at New Energy Finance, what did I do when that came along, 2004? Did I know more than anybody else about solar technology? Absolutely not. Did I know more than anybody else about corporate finance or about project finance? Absolutely not. Or policy and regulation. I hadn't come from this space. I'd studied energy, but it's not the sector that I had worked in. I'd been in media and so on. And but what I did was I kind of had a bit of everything and an ability to translate. So I did a lot of talking to big energy companies and innovative little energy companies and policymakers and venture capitalists and project financiers and regulators and civic society. And that was really, so I think I'm sort of furiously agreeing that you need to bring things together in order to catalyze progress. And right now, when I'm not doing podcasts and speaking and writing for Bloomberg, which I still do, I work on finance and investing through Ecopragma Capital. But the piece, the bit of the life cycle that we're focusing on is not early stage development of technology or rinse and repeat project finance. It's the bit in between. It's the bit where things can either cusp upwards or not. So the commercialization, we call it the sneeze, because that's an analogy that I've used. Some of these technologies, you wait and wait and wait, and then just like waiting for a sneeze, it's going to work. Heat pumps in domestic heating, it's the only solution, right? You just don't know quite when the explosive growth is going to happen. And when it does, it's going to put a bunch of people out of business, and it's going to create, the analogy from the digital times, Amazon was not the first online retailer, right? But it reached that sneeze point and changed the world, absolutely changed the world. So what are those sneeze points? And we've seen it with solar, we've seen it to a certain extent with wind. We're seeing it with electric vehicles. It's absolutely clear, even though some people push back and say not. But what are those sneeze points? And then how do you put the finance together to support those companies as they pass through this incredibly rapid change?
I love that. I missed your sneeze analogy in the past, and it's a good one, that sort of itchy sense that things are about to switch in a big way. I wanted to get into one of the major themes. Well, first of all, I want to get back to this complexity. My journalism on this goes back to the 80s, and back then it was all kind of, this felt like an environmental story. You had stuff we're putting in the atmosphere, it's changing the climate, and therefore stop putting it in or taking it out. And then I had my own learning curve, and some of the steps are, it's a pollution story, it's a technical story, it's a heroes and villains story. It's all Exxon's fault. It's justice story, it's behavior. And of course, it's all of those things. And the same thing goes for the climate picture, whether you're in the solution space or journalism or whatever. Then I found out that to me, this felt paralytic, but now it feels enabling, because there's so many ways you can latch on to this issue, whatever your skill set is. I don't know, when you talk to people, I imagine, now we have all the doomers who are saying we're screwed because we're already so clearly beyond 2 degrees. And that leads me often to feel like they're just promoting paralysis and disengagement more than engagement. When you go into a room and you meet someone who's not heavily tuned in, who might have that sense of paralysis, how do you break this down yourself to say, oh, come on, assuming you're not paralyzed yourself, and I don't think you are.
No, we have no choice to be. We can't be paralyzed, because this is our planet. These are our lives. This is what we do. And so we can't be paralyzed. And it's absolutely clear that, now I disagree with anybody who says it's clear we're going beyond 2 degrees. Back in, I think it was 2018, I just started publicly saying we're not going to hold to 1.5 degrees, right? It destroys credibility to pretend that we're going to be at 1.5 degrees. Right. And I'm not prepared to do that, because I think one of my answers to how do you communicate, how do you kind of keep a path through this, is just stick to the science, stick to the facts. And also, by the way, acknowledge when there is uncertainty, absolutely.
Right.
But what you can't do is sort of double down. And, if you look at achieving 1.5 degrees, at one point we could have done it by reducing emissions by, 20%, then 30%, then 40%, then 50% by 2030. Right now, there is no chance that we're going to reduce emissions by 2030 to be on track for 1.5 degrees, because the drop becomes more and more vertical. And at some point, everybody has to say it's not happening.
Right.
And I've been saying it earlier because, I'm just aware of the sheer physicality of what needs to change in terms of energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, but also the human nature issues. Those people who say, oh, it's so bad, degrowth is the answer.
Right.
And, degrowth, a wonderfully attractive philosophy for rich people in rich, well-off, rich, comfortable people, usually young, living in cities in Europe or maybe on the coast. Nobody in the global south that I've ever met has suggested degrowth as a solution. So we have to stick to the facts as they are and reasonable solutions, things that we can believe in and we can back up with STEM knowledge. And I do think we can achieve 2 degrees still. Now, are we naturally going to fall into doing the things? No, it's going to be a huge amount of work. We have to engage and do it, but 2 degrees is still deliverable. And 2 degrees is better than 1.9. 1.9 is better than 1.8. 1.8 is the other way around. I'm mixing my words. 1.8 is better than 1.9. 1.9 is better than 2, and 2 is better than 2.1, and so on and so on. So we engage. My own journey, not a million miles different from yours, except that it comes from my background, initially doing hard science, so physics, then engineering, then a lot of finance, bit of macroeconomics, and then a lot of regulation and politics. And at the end of the day, I think you kind of end up at anthropology and narratives, because we can stay at 2 degrees and humans can engage in great tasks. They can, I don't want to say make sacrifices, because I'm not sure that this is a sacrifice. With the right narrative, it's incredibly empowering and therefore shouldn't feel like a sacrifice. But we can do extraordinary things if we're activated and switched on in the right way. And I think that's the piece that I am not seeing. It's become sort of technocratic and also captured by different political tribes. There's a tribe of environmental left, and then there's a tribe that pushes back on the right. And when somehow we failed to say, actually, this is a thing we can solve. How magnificent if we could hand over a planet in pretty good shape with an economy and infrastructure and systems that are no longer jeopardizing it to our kids or grandkids or to future generations. Isn't that an incredibly wonderful thing to be working on? That's why I work on it. I think that's a huge vision.
Sure.
So I then cut through some of the complexity just by saying, I like the goal and I'm prepared to do what it takes.
Well, and that gets to, you pointed to something that I've written about a lot, because I think you and I and others who've tried to make that point, we run into the culture of my solution is better than your solution. People, and not only that, but people get invested in solar or nuclear or the like, and they find it impossible to say we need it all.
Well, and the other thing, and this comes back to actually something that I wanted to come in earlier on, they then spend huge amounts of energy and time arguing with each other over what is effectively the last 5 or 10%.
Right.
You can't do solar, you can't do renewables because it'll never deal with this weather phenomenon, which happens once a year and lasts 8 days. And you think, well,
right.
Why don't we just solve the bits that we can rather than focusing and arguing about this last few percent? So I'm not sure I would jump to saying all of the above, because that includes some things that are so kind of expensive or disruptive that we actually probably shouldn't be doing them. But why don't we at least do all of what's right in front of our noses? We know we can decarbonize electricity. We know we can have transport can go electric. We know heating can go electric. And we know that half of industry can go electric. And when I say can, I mean relatively easily within the technologies that we know or could develop and put together into packages, and within the financing capability of the world, and probably within its politics if we stop being all tribal. So why on earth are we not doing that? Why are we talking about all this other stuff and not going, I don't want to say full speed, because there's other priorities as well. healthcare and
Sure.
and education and inclusion of bringing people out of poverty and so on. But why are we not at least a little bit more rational in addressing what's right in front of our noses in this case?
Yeah, well, I think you're spot on. When the Inflation Reduction Act came through and the infrastructure law here in America, there were these tens of billions of dollars available. And I was trying to write pieces that were saying, so many environmental groups have spent so much time pointing to Washington, and it was mostly with a no message. And now suddenly we're in a world of abundance, not just energy abundance, but finance abundance. Jigar Shah was sitting on this pot of money, and I had him on the show, and he said, well, all we need now is people to get active on the ground in your community. Go to your school districts and say, we can finance electric buses for this amount and it'd be payoff, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's been such a profound shift for so many sort of climate hawks to actually think about things in that new way, where it's about opportunity that's right here. What's missing isn't so much in Washington right now, it's in your community. But anyway, and then I want to shift to the Trump problem, but I don't know what you're thinking about that is. It's just such a different...
I was just going to say there's always been lots of money, plenty of money. There's amazing statistic. When I started New Energy Finance, and one of the first things that I did, I didn't do it initially. I didn't do it, but I then went to an offsite at Pocantico, in upstate New York,
Sure.
The Rockefeller Summer House, I think it is. And there was a group of people, and somebody said, we have the solutions, solar and wind. We just need to spend 100 times more on them because it's what we're doing is completely inadequate. And I thought 100 times, and I hang out with a lot of people developing, even then, 2005, this would have been, I know 2005, I still know a lot of people developing wind farms and solar and all this stuff. 100 is a big number. So I spent the night calculating how much was being invested in clean energy in the transition. And it was something like, right now that we've gone back through the figures, it's $36 billion. Well, guess what? Last year, that was $1.8 trillion. And there's always been loads of money. There's always been loads of money. It's just that investors will come in, to projects that are well structured, that are risk managed, that might need a little bit of blended finance from a government or from the World Bank, but really, I don't want to say de minimis, but we do need good policy. There's plenty of money. Money has never been the problem here. And even technologies, there's always been a frontier where you could use the technologies profitably to address opportunities. And there's so much talk about, we need a carbon price. And you got these people saying that. It's like, well, why aren't you at least doing what works? If energy efficiency works, or solar works, or adding a battery to overcome a grid constraint, if that works, why do you spend your time saying we need a global, and there was this whole, we need a global price on carbon, a single price on carbon worldwide? So there's no political delivery mechanism to get that. So 40 years been talking about it. It's not going to happen. And yet you have people who'll devote enormous energy to that rather than to rolling out what they've got.
Oh boy. Yeah. So what needs to change there? We have these mechanisms that evolved, and again, 1988, when I started reporting on this, it was that led to the IPCC and the treaty. They're all global. They're all about the big picture numbers. They're not about your community's power supply and sort of the smaller scale ways of thinking about finance. And we still seem often stuck with that. Right now is Davos. I'm sure that global price on carbon message is there, et cetera. Do you feel like we're stuck still with that framing or not?
So I'm not in Davos. I haven't been for a few years. I have been in the past. I got frustrated because I discovered that all of the people working on climate and clean energy were out in the World Food Tent in some hotel car park, and all of the oil, gas, sort of fossily people, they all had conference hall passes. And so I just said, look, I can't do that. I mean, if we're going to have a conversation about energy, and if we're going to say that we want to improve the world and deal with climate change, I got to be in the core discussion, not the side discussion. Right. So I don't go, and I'm not really following what's coming out of there. I think you will remember lots of conversations about top down versus bottom up, right? Especially around Copenhagen, which was, we're going to set a global carbon budget, then we're going to negotiate to divide it between India and the US and China and whatever, and then we're going to just lock it in and execute for decades. In fact, China didn't get any of the budget reductions, which was part of the problem. And when Copenhagen collapsed, I actually called at the time to just abandon that process, just get rid of UNFCCC, because it was embarrassing. For those of us who are practitioners or informing practitioners, it was embarrassing to do this kind of, to have this ethereal, the gods on Mount Olympus debating, failing, and us down in the real world seeing all this opportunity to make progress, but being derided because we were being associated, we were sort of guilt by association with the failure. And I was just saying, do bottom up. Municipality, city, your company, your household, your community, so much to do, just do it. And I was wrong at that extreme, because 4 years later, whatever it was, 5 years later, we had the Paris Agreement, which was very helpful for the momentum and the mood music. So we have this interplay between top down and bottom up. What I will say, with what's been happening in Washington over the last few days, and in fact, in the US and other places, by the way, in France, in Germany, in Slovakia, in Hungary, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Canada, right, in Australia, there's a pushback against that sort of ethereal top-down, we're now going to tell you what's good for you, and it'll cost more, but take your medicine because we're the great and good, and we understand. You may not like it, but you really do. You just don't know you do. A sort of dictatorship of the proletariat approach.
Right.
That the pendulum has swung against that 2-3 years ago. Some of the people up on Mount Olympus have not realized that, and they're still going off to COP meetings in Baku and promising investments of hundreds of billions and it's so tone deaf. So
Absolutely.
This would be a period I would be working much more grassroots, bottom up, create the kind of facts on the ground that shows that those school buses, they might need a bit of pump priming from a Jigger Shah loan program office, but in 3 or 4 years, everybody's doing them without that support. And by the way, they're now doing them in countries that don't have that support because the economic model is so obvious, right? If we can get there with more and more segments, then we don't need the gods up on Mount Olympus to be delivering us goodies consistently. We can actually sort of do without them for a few years.
Yeah, I know. And that this gets to the Trumpian moment. I think you're right about losing track of the yellow vests and so many things happening around the rest of the at least the Northern Hemisphere. That the need, one thing that was demonstrated with the IRA, and is still playing out and could still blunt Trumpism, is that most of those benefits were accruing in red states. As Jigar likes to say, they're the police departments that were buying Teslas or American EVs were mostly Republican districts. And then you get that sort of follow-on conversation and normalization of things.
But look, there was this theory that somehow, because so much of the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act money and the Infrastructure Act, and because so much flowed to red states, that there would be a kind of a realization that it was in their interest not to re-elect President Trump. I never believed that. And the reason is, if you look at, there's so many Trump voters who were benefiting from Obamacare, but outraged at Obamacare. We saw that at huge scale. And, that's a lot of that. You can start to sort of blame low information voters or whatever, but that's just the wrong response. The right response is to say, okay, I get it. We're in a political knife fight here. It's about identification. It's about narratives. And, so the idea that, just because somebody's got a battery factory grant, or just because they've received some IRA money, that's going to change the way they vote, or even more, that's going to change President Trump's mind is, I don't want to use the word delusional, but that's not the way it works. Now, he might be forced or encouraged to change his mind by enough Republican governors or by whatever corridor chats with whatever, figures, Tucker Carlson or whoever can change his mind. It's not going to be you and me, and it's not going to be anybody who cares about the climate. It's going to be some other intermediaries that are in that kind of matrix on that side of politics. It's very frustrating to watch, but you I sort of feel, you'll call it edgy, but we have to play with the cards we're dealt. We have to deal with the world as it is, not the world that you'd like it to be, where everybody is sort of a technocratic loyalty type. You could say A plus B is C, therefore D, therefore E, therefore you must vote this and do that. That's not how politics works. Surely we should realize that after the last sort of 10 years. But go back in history, it's never been like that.
Yeah. Do you have, if you were able to sit in a room with Trump's new Secretary of Energy and maybe Trump, well, how would you frame an argument for an energy future that you would prefer?
Well, so look, I'm a never Trumper, so I would hope that I would never get into that particular room. His energy secretary, Chris Wright, is a very interesting person because actually he's incredibly brilliant and incredibly articulate, very analytical. I've looked at some of the presentations that he's given going back in time and some of the things he's written. And, he's built a very successful energy business, hugely successful. He's also, back in his history, he's worked on solar when he was a grad student, and he's invested in geothermal and nuclear through some startups. And the one area that I think sort of is very troubling about and by the way, he's very committed. I should also say he's very committed to energy abundance, as am I. And he's committed to energy abundance in the US and around the world. So there's a huge amount of common ground. I will say that if I do have the privilege of meeting him, I would like to spend a lot of time on that common ground, explaining that actually I want the same things as him, and that actually I'm a markets person and I'm a conservative, small c, and in the UK, big C. And so I'm not interested in state overreach. I'm not interested in trying to control people's lives, but I'm also a scientist, and I've dug very deep into the climate science, and where Chris Wright says that, he's essentially is channeling Nordhaus in his climate science. So he says William Nordhaus won a Nobel Prize for the DICE model, which showed that although there is damage, which he acknowledges, there's damage from climate change at 3.5 degrees centigrade of warming by the end of the century, that damage is less damaging than if you tried to do something about it, broadly speaking. So the damage function that Nordhaus uses says 3.5 degrees by the end of the century. And the guy got a Nobel Prize. But what I would suggest is that what I know is that isn't not just an outlier amongst climate scientists. I don't care, in a sense, put them aside. I don't think a 3 degree or a 3.5 degree world by 2100, and by the way, with a gradient which is still increasing after 2100, right? So therefore, more warming in a time when my children might still be alive and their children, very definitely ought to be still alive. That is not an acceptable outcome. That is not an acceptable outcome. I don't care how Nordhaus calculated it. I don't care what discount rate he used. It's not acceptable. Yeah. And so that's the conversation I would try to get into, to say, let's try and examine that damage function, because between Nordhaus doing that work and today, what we know is that would be a profoundly damaged planet and economy, and something I know you care a lot about, damaged resilience and increased vulnerability of literally billions of people. That's what I think. And, so hopefully I would be able to establish enough common ground around the things that we agree on to be able to say, we cannot, as conservatives, walk away from our responsibility to planet and people, which is truly under threat. They're truly under threat by this trajectory that we're on.
Right. Well, hopefully those conversations, there'll be space for them it's hard to envision, but it's conceivable.
Andy, let me tell you, I had a similar conversation with Tony Abbott. Now, you'll remember he was the Australian Prime Minister who got rid of carbon pricing in Australia,
right.
And very contrarian, skeptical, whatever you want to call it, on climate change. And I was on the board of trade with him, and I was able to have really deep and quite warm conversations with him because I established that I am a free trade advocate. I'm a conservative. If it wasn't for planetary boundaries, I'd be a pretty dry conservative. And I mean real conservative, not what the Republicans and blah, blah, blah. But, so I established some common ground because I do philosophically, in many ways, agree with those positions of that constituency. But then I separate from them only on certain issues. But I was able to have really interesting conversations with Tony Abbott on those and maybe move him away from some of the more extreme positions that he had previously taken.
Well, and that gets to, you started with the common ground and you built the trust and the fluency, and then you go to the tougher questions. I think that's a methodology and an ability, a sort of willingness to cross thresholds that is still kind of lacking. I think these next several years, there's certainly a lot of need for more of it among the community, the environmental community that seems to have been so stuck in a certain way of looking at the problem.
Yeah, and what I know will not work is just amping up, saying, you don't understand how dangerous it is. We're all, the climate change is going to, our kids are going to die of climate change, or we're going to, there's going to be a global crop failure. So, because that, to overtrade the science will definitely not work. To try and scare these people into somehow, waking up, that I can guarantee you is not going to work.
No, and that was part of my learning curve in the media side of this too. The story I did in the for Science Digest magazine back in 1988 was very much here it is.
Yeah,
Earth melting on a hot plate. And it was designed to scare and petrify. And there was a Time magazine cover not long afterwards. It said, "Be worried, be very worried." And that's when I started interviewing social scientists in the early aughts, 2006. And they were saying, no, that's not how it works. The deficit model is a failure. The idea that you just fill people with your vision of the problem and that takes them to a new place is just fallacy. I want to get to this concept of net zero one more time. Just you've written two pieces, well, many times about it, but you had two long pieces last year, a couple of years or so. The harder argument for it and sort of the easier argument. So how do you? What's your thumbnail? Quick definition of net zero let's say by 2050, and just a quick sense from you of the hardness and then why it's doable.
So net zero, it's funny because it has become a controversial term, and I'm not quite sure why, because for me, it just means that the emissions, we're emitting CO2, and there are also things that are happening that we're doing that are absorbing CO2, and they need to net out so that there's no more CO2 being added to the atmosphere. And to me, that seems like a sort of truism. It's pretty obvious. The reason we need to do that, and this may not be well understood by particularly people who are not immersed in these topics, is that as long as we keep putting even low levels of CO2 into the atmosphere, they accrue there because it has such a long dwell time. And you've put up a graphic of filling a swimming pool and turning off the hose. Even if the hose just drips, this level in the swimming pool will be going up.
Yeah.
And it started at 280 parts per million pre-industrial revolution times, and it's now at 420, 430. And as long as it keeps going up, as long as we keep emitting, it's going to keep going up, and that is going to cause damage to the planet, to the economy, to the ice caps, et cetera, et cetera. So net zero is basically, when we've got that under control, is when maybe we have no more emissions, or we have some, but then we're removing some. And if I might, I want to just address one thing which I I think you've heard a lot of times, and I certainly have, is 420 parts per million. Parts per million. It's so small. If this was a football stadium, it would be, it would be a couple of people in a 60,000 seat, whatever,
Right.
and so on. That is irrelevant. That shows STEM ignorance when people say that, because what causes the warming, what causes the radiation, captures the radiation as it goes out and stops it going out, it's not the ratio of molecules that causes the problem. It's the concentration, the partial pressure of CO2 molecules.
Mm-hmm.
That partial pressure, having gone from 280 to 420, has gone up by 50%. 50% change in a couple of human lifetimes, 3, 4, maybe human lifetimes maximum. That is a huge and rapid change in the geophysics of our planet. It's nothing to do with concentrations. It's to do with those partial pressures. And it's really scary, because if it goes to 500, 550, which we could easily see within numbers of decades, it's going at about 3 parts per million per year. That is why we have to address this issue. And net zero, simple version is when we've done that.
Right. And it's about sinks and sources. Now this gets to some of the criticisms are how even in the IPCC reports they were asked how you get there, and they came up with putative pathways like biomass burning and power plants at climate scale that have no real credibility, or at least very little credibility in the world. And there are other, then you monetize it all, and that leads to a lot of skepticism and in the parts of the environmental community. So what's the way forward there? How do you measure success if there's plasticity and even in how those things are looked at?
Well, so the first thing is there's just so much we can do to mitigate, just to reduce emissions. Nothing that happens over on the removal side should be taken as a get out of jail free card. That should be pretty straightforward to understand, because when you're trying to capture something, trying to remove emissions, you're undoing the burning of something, and it's a lot easier not to burn it in the first place. And I laugh at people who want to do e-fuels, by the way, because it's like, we're going to burn a fuel, we're going to turn it into water vapor and CO2, and then somebody's going to capture the water vapor, take the water, split it into hydrogen, capture the CO2, combine them and make a fuel, and then they look at you very seriously and say, and we can do that cheaper than fossil fuels. It's like, no, there's this thing called irreversibility and thermodynamics and work. And by the way, then there's also capital expenditure and maintenance and all sorts. You're not going to do that. So mitigation first, there's no question about that.
Right.
But we are going to have to remove as well, because there are process emissions from cement production, or there are sectors like aviation where it's extremely expensive to produce a fuel. And I take it as read, we're not going to stop flying around, right? That's just not, we can fly less. Right. I would like to fly less. I think we should have, more expensive flights, but we're still going to fly. And it's going to be cheaper to remove CO2 from the air than it is to make a fuel for that use case. So we are going to have to get into the process of removing some of the CO2. And what I would say, though, is the word there is removing. All of the credits that say, all of these carbon credits for, avoided emissions, even avoided deforestation and reforestation, those ones are so plastic, so open to fraud, so questionable, so temporary, that they really don't form part of the solution. They really can't. Maybe to cover some methane issues, some short-lived pollutants, but we've really got to be in the business of mitigate and remove, and that's it.
Yep. What's your take on methane? It's another one. Through my decades on this, I've seen it flip. There are serious scientists like Ray Pierre Humbert, who a decade ago or more were saying, no, these short-lived things you're missing the big gorilla in the greenhouse is CO2. It really is CO2. And now there's much more talk about the short-lived pollutants, methane and the chlorofluorocarbons and the like. Is that because we've gotten closer to the edge of what people think of as the safety margin, and so there's more sense of urgency on those, or is there something that flipped in the science? Do you have your own sense of methane?
Look, it's an incredibly serious issue. I think on the 20-year time horizon, if I'm not wrong, from memory, it's about 1/3 of warming on the 20-year horizon. But of course, it's much less on a 100-year horizon. So
Right.
if you're worrying about 2100, you could say, yeah, methane, not that important. But if you worry about 2050, very important.
Right.
And so it depends on, I personally, I'm less worried about 2100 because I think we will have largely solved this issue 2060, 2070, because burning things is such a dumb way of doing things when there's an alternative. So you've got the piece on the screen there. You're showing my two pieces. I wrote one which said, oh, it's going to be really hard. But ultimately I came down on the side of actually net zero is going to be easier than you think, but it will be slower. It's not going to be 2050, but by 2070 we'll be there or almost there, because frankly, burning things is dumb and there's lots of alternatives. So, I think I worry much more about the 2050, 2060 period, when we'll be at, we won't yet be at net zero, and there'll be dramatic stress on ecosystems, economies, society. There will be damages, and we will not yet have had the time, and in the case of the global south, the wealth to have insulated ourselves, to have adapted, because that's also a very important part of this.
Yeah, and you mentioned the global south and the energy imbalances in the world. And earlier you talked, and I'm a fan of the reality that we are an energy abundant. There's an energy abundance imperative. I think many of us who have literally an overabundance of energy, that's a whole discussion, but so much of the world is under energized. And the equity issue relates to who does the net zero work. I want to show you a quick quote, a quick comment from Johan Rockström on this show several years ago. We were talking about energy equity within the context of climate with several people from parts of Africa. And just listen, it's a short comment about the unappreciated energy reality that has to be integrated, as Rockström is the planetary boundaries pioneer, says, into how we think about climate success.
The big dramas is that when the IPCC concludes we have only 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide remaining in the carbon budget to have any chance of holding the 1.5 degrees Celsius planetary boundary limit line, then of course the question is, how do we share that in a responsible and equitable way? And almost however you count on that, you end up with very dramatic numbers because of the inequality in the world. And in the 10 NICs, the 10 new insights, we did one very basic assessment, which is basically just checking what's the per capita emission today among the different categories of people according to the levels of wealth. And then not surprisingly, we get very shocking results that the 1% richest people in the world need to reduce their emissions by a factor 30 to have any chance of holding the 1.5 line, while 50%, half of the world's population, the poor half of the world's population, actually, based on equity assessments, should have the right of increasing their emissions by a factor 3 in order to have energy access, basic provision of energy utilities, and still stay within a global carbon budget if you take an equitable assessment of how you share the remaining budget in a per capita way. And this, of course, comes from the statistics we all know, that we are today having we have 1 billion people without access to electricity. We have sub-Saharan African countries, if you exclude South Africa, which have a per capita availability of energy which is pathetically low. I mean, it's equivalent to having a very small camping refrigerator as your entire energy availability on average, and compare that with the US or European citizen, which has, 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 40 times, 50 times, 60 times, 70 times, 80 times, 90 times, 100 times, 200 times, 300 times, 400 times, 500 times, 600 times, 700 times, 800 times, 900 times, 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 40 times, 50 times, 60 times, 70 times, 80 times, 100 times, 200 times, 300 times, 400 times, 500 times, 600 times, 700 times, 800 times, 900 times, 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 40 times, 50 times, 60 times, 70 times, 80 times, 100 times, 200 times, 300 times, 400 times, 500 times, 600 times, 700 times, 80 times, 100 times, 200 times, 300 times, 400 times, 500 times, 6 10, 20 times higher energy availability. So that the energy inequity in the world is staggering. And now is the question, how do we hold the line while addressing equity?
That seems so profoundly important to me. You can quibble with the numbers of 30-fold cuts. The rich are not going to cut their emissions 30-fold. And
No,
sorry.
Yeah, can I come in on this? Because
totally.
I don't quibble with the numbers. I mean, it's there's sort of profound truths there, right, about equality and inequality. But I look at it, and there's a few observations I would make, which is, first of all, it's defining equity as the same amount of energy. Well, how about if, I was involved in Sustainable Energy for All, SDG 7, before it was even called either of those things. Mm-hmm. And, if you're going to jump to energy services provided by solar and battery, the total amount of energy that you need for that is profoundly less as well, right? Because in the north, we're having to, heat our homes, and we've got a legacy system that has us doing it with fossil fuels, which are very inefficient. The primary energy fallacy, right? We start with a huge amount of energy, and then we use about a third of it. Well, if in the global south, you can start with a small amount of energy, but use it efficiently, and by the way, you don't need some of the heating loads and so on, then equity is all about human progress and about life chance and so on. It's not about kilowatt hours and saying, well, you had this, so I got to have that. So yes, I agree. Clearly, the wealthier have to do more of the hard work reducing, but the 30x and the 10x and so on, they don't worry me nearly as much as those numbers would have us believe. It's much more achievable. And the context is also, of course, that the G20 is actually reducing its emissions. Right? What we've actually got going on is G20, Europe, US, Japan, actually reducing emissions quite considerably, not fast enough, not consistent with what Johan Rockström there is talking about, but reducing. And then they are going up in, still, but not for long, China. But then the real big questions would be, India, Africa, and then some of the big other developing countries, the Malaysias and Indonesias and so on. It's much less hopeless than that picture and those numbers would suggest.
Yeah, I think this idea of focusing on energy services seems so clear to me. I had a conversation with Bill Gates in 2016 for an hour in Seattle when I was still at the Times. And, he's all about big energy, obviously. And I asked him, I said, I'd gotten to know Harish Hande, who's an Indian entrepreneur who does I
know Harish well. I know Harish.
He does village scale energy transformation at scale, in India and also parts of Africa. And I just think it's fantastic. And for Gates, that didn't even seem to register as part of his climate success.
So I got into trouble with Gates's team in 2016 because I stood up at the Bloomberg NEF summit and said, because Bill Gates had said some things about, the answer has to be nuclear and huge. And it's all based on Václav Smil. Well, Václav Smil at the time had fallen into the primary energy fallacy. He was saying the world uses this much energy and renewables, is this small. Well, 2/3 of the big number he was citing is thermal waste, which wind, solar, and hydro do not produce. And we don't want them to produce it. And so I stood up, explained this, and then said, look, Bill Gates was the guy who nearly missed the internet, right? He was a guy who was all about, the Microsoft walled garden approach to the internet. I can't remember what it was called, Microsoft Network. And so these distributed solutions pass these people by sometimes. And Bill Gates has done a lot of catching up. There you go. That's the primary energy. And
which I was stuck on for a long time. We had this conversation, and it did help change my thinking that the past is always not prologue to the future when you think about energy sufficiency, meaning what we need from energy.
So that chart there from Our World in Data is based on BP. Now it's the Energy Institute that has taken over those data, but they actually adjust the wind, solar, hydro. They multiply by a factor of, I think, 2.4. So that's not the worst chart. The IEA ones are the most misleading. But the amazing is, if you really want to make the point and do your head in, then how does a heat pump work in primary energy terms? use a little bit of electricity, and you get for free a whole load of heat from the environment. And this is not trivial. This is half of all industrial heat and all domestic and commercial heating that could be done in that way. And that little piece of electricity could easily be renewable, or frankly, it could be nuclear as well. But it's going to profoundly change the shape of that chart, and it's much easier to transform heating in that way than it is to it's misleading to say we have to replace all low temperature heating, which is this huge chunk, when you actually don't. You only have to produce this little bit of electricity to do it.
Right. Where are the best visualizations or sort of analyses of that? If you could have a chart showing
the answer, there are some Sankey diagrams that show this. The IEA actually does try to sort of inform, and so does Lawrence Berkeley. You've got that Lawrence Berkeley Sankey, and just look at the thing that says wasted energy, and guess what? That waste is not coming from solar and wind. It's coming from thermal waste, largely out of not just power stations, but also in a car. 75% of the gasoline that we put into our cars is thermal waste. Just doesn't drive the car forwards an inch. It's just wasted. Whereas in an electric car, it's just 10% waste. So you do get those Sankey diagrams. I made a push a couple of years ago to say, look, all of these people, IEA, EIA, Agora Energiewende, DNVGL, Bloomberg NEF, McKinsey, can we just talk about energy services? The first chapter of your reports should be, these are the energy services we need, which, by the way, Chris Wright, we really want to grow. I really want to grow energy services. I'm not talking about reducing energy at all. I'm interested in abundance, right? But energy, I'm interested in abundance of energy services. Let's make that chapter 1. And then let's make the rest of the report about how we achieve that in a low carbon way. And then at the last chapter should be, oh, by the way, if you do all those wonderful things, lots of energy services, but made through clean energy and efficiency and heat pumps and electric this and that. Oh, by the way, your primary energy has shrunk by a factor of 60%.
Yes.
But who cares? Who cares? Because the energy services are what people actually, those people in the global south, they want energy services. Cold beers, warm homes, air conditioning, lights, good lighting in their factories, and so on. I was going to say the other person who has done a great calculation of this is Saul Griffiths, Electrify Everything.
Right.
So that it's out there, but if we could get the narrative around energy services up front in all of this coverage, we would do ourselves an enormous favor. And by the way, I think that somebody like Chris Wright and I would have a fabulous conversation starting from chapter 1, which we can't have if you start from that primary energy chapter.
Boy, this is where path dependency gets in the way of progress, because the IPCC, even the structure of the IPCC and these institutions, they've already got their metrics and as you said, BP, and it's a very hard thing to literally flip mental models on that scale. But I do agree with you. And maybe we could do a follow-up conversation, maybe with Saul, who I know you've had on your show, and but on, what would it take to change at that scale? So when the IPCC convenes, or when the treaty meets, they're thinking about that. And that gets to climate services too, which is about resilience on the other end.
Yeah, and look, all I can do to change it is I can try to explain whenever I get an opportunity, and I can create the odd hashtag. So I can create a hashtag primary energy is, I'm not sure if this is a family show, but I have primary energy is bollocks. And by the way, there's another one, which is also the same, which is energy return on energy invested. I mean, these things drive me crazy because that is a dimensionless, it's a dimensionless number. And yet people use it to show that we can't possibly grow. It's always the problem is always renewable energies that are painted as, you can't grow them fast enough to do anything because their energy return on energy invested. It's like, look, if you have an energy return on energy invested of 21, and 61, but it's over 20 years, and 61 over 60 years, they are identical. It's like making an investment in something, a 20-year bond that's got a third of the cash to cash return, but you can then make it 3 times in the time, so there's so much poor thinking in this whole space. So all I can do is try and explain it, create a hashtag, and see if the community can slowly be kind of moved a little bit towards rationality.
Yeah, and here's on Twitter, Jan Rusnow. You must know him, I think.
Yes, of course.
He talks about the primary energy fallacies, the idea that all primary energy from fossil fuels must be replaced with an equal amount of clean energy. And he's got a good.
He's done great work. He's done great work on that. And there are, I think, there's quite a few people who understand the primary energy fallacy is bollocks. There's fewer people who understand the energy return on energy invested. That one we still have not even begun to unwrap in any meaningful way.
Okay.
But it would help. It would really help if, as I say, IEA, EIA, Bloomberg, McKinsey actually started to focus people on energy services. And, I actually had some ideas also, Our World in Data, how we could create some information tools so that journalists, instead of saying, whose primary energy is bigger, that must be a bigger economy, actually to say, well, look, let's start with energy services and then look at how they're fulfilled. And you could then, compare. Well, there's a lot you could do to clarify and create tools, but I'm not resourced to do that.
Yeah. And of course, in developing countries, some of this will be seen as a scam. The rich world is saying, we don't need as much energy as they had, and that kind of thing.
Can I tell you that the reason, you talk about path dependency.
Yeah.
Why does the IEA call something primary energy demand, which is not demand, it's supply, right? And the reason goes back to post-colonial times and the first oil crisis, because there was suddenly, it looked like we're being denied our birthright to grab this energy, to bring this energy in from the Middle East. And so suddenly there was this need to understand, an economy, demands energy. At that time, there was no, there was no renewable. There was a bit of hydro. There was some hydro, and that was it. But it was a quick stock take to say, if you have an economy, how much energy do you need?
Yeah.
And so it was all about getting our arms around. It was a very much an acquisitive approach, as opposed to now what we need to do is to focus on the energy services, the cold beer, the warm homes, the air conditioning, the factories, the transport. And the homework question is not how do we grab it from the global south, right? It is actually how do we do it without trashing our planet affordably? A totally different question. And yet we're stuck, path dependency, calling this thing demand, which has got almost entirely nothing to do with demand.
Yeah. Well, we will have to do more on that question for sure. I want to throw one more graph at you. It's one I kind of take some comfort in it. Weirdly, but it's very depressing in other ways. This is about decarbonization, the rate of decarbonization globally. And Holger Ragnar he's ill, very ill these days, but he was at IIASA. And he's done this long time scale look from 1800 to recent years of the carbon per unit of energy. And you don't see a lot of policy junctures there. It's not like the Paris Agreement or something else changes things in big ways. The emergence of modern China absolutely changed things. And that's probably why that curve slowed down at a certain point. And so how do you take comfort in knowing that this is the work of lifetimes, not just your lifetime? And then we'll get back to some closing thoughts.
Well, so, you said it, China made a decision in the, whatever it was, around the sort of 1980-ish, I can't remember, some better historians than me will tell me when it was the decision to join the WTO and so on. But it was an export-led growth, and those exports were fueled with coal. And so you absolutely do see the policy intervention. What you see is it counterbalancing other policies in other countries or other economics, not just policy, not everything is policy. So this chart is an amalgam of dramatic changes, dramatic changes, rapid changes. The UK had 42% coal-fired electricity in 2012.
Amazing.
And now it's zero. It's zero last year. So that is a period of 12 years from 42% to zero. And we've seen these dramatic changes in China. Now 52% of cars are electric, being sold are electric, either fully battery electric or plug-in hybrid. And we no longer have to use Norway as the example of rapid electrification of transport. There's China. So we've got these rapid changes. So if anybody looks at this chart and says, oh, Václav Smil would say, and Holger Rogan, these things are very slow and we need to understand it. No, you've got rapid things going up, rapid things going down. And the other thing that we've not talked about is demographics. And demographics and wealth. So what we're actually going to have, China is about to turn around and see coal fall off the system the exact same way that we've seen in the US and we've seen in Europe. And India and Africa are probably going to see it soaring at the scale that China saw. If we're not, if we're not careful, if they're not careful, we don't impose. And they're the ones they're the ones that have agency. We're not. But if wrong decisions are made, what we'll see is more rapid falls and more rapid increases, and the thing going flat or maybe declining slowly. But I have absolute faith that we could be in this could look very different in 15 or 20 years. It won't be at zero. We won't be at net zero in 2050, but could it resume the sort of rapid fall that we saw between, I think that's kind of 1950 to 1970? Yeah, absolutely. And then that chart will look completely different. Absolutely. We could see this thing turn downwards.
And it's about filling those development gaps and getting those energy services as much as possible from modern energy, meaning energy that doesn't come with its own downsides.
Right. And, and we have huge, and exciting and interesting discussions about whether it should all be nuclear or all be wind, solar and water, or whether hydrogen is going to be the savior and so on. And actually, it's really trivial. It's very simple. It's right in front of our faces. We know we can decarbonize electricity. We know that because we've been doing it, and not just in the developed world, but even in the developing world, in the global south and so on. We know we can electrify transport. We know we can electrify heating, and we know we can electrify half of industry pretty easily. So we have most of the tools, almost all of the tools required to bend that curve very quickly downwards. I'm sorry, I'm an optimist. What can I say?
Yeah, no, that's good. If you have a couple more minutes, there actually are the last second here. There's some questions and comments that came in. If you wanted to run through them, if you have time.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
On LinkedIn, Andrew Patty second says, this is about phrasing and metrics. Might the nomenclature focus on net energy versus gross energy to get at the inefficiencies of certain energy sources, to understand the impact of switching to a more efficient, higher ratio of net versus gross energy resources? Policy can't be moved if you can't make a compelling case that is simple enough for average legislators and average voters.
I would how can I put it? I'm not sure that simplifies things, because when I see net energy, then it's, for instance, there's this thing called final energy. Okay, so you've got primary energy is the coal, the gas, the oil that you dig out of the ground. And then there's final energy, which is when you sell it to somebody who uses it. And that kind of worked for many decades. The problem with final energy is it's the petrol you put into your car, and it's the electricity you buy from your utility. But of course, that's not really, and you might say, well, maybe that sounds like what you're headed for, Andrew, with your net energy. But it's not, because in your car, what actually you use is only 25% of the gasoline or diesel that you put in. The rest goes off as heat. And the same with your house. The electricity you buy from your utility actually brings in ambient heat if you've got a heat pump. So I'm afraid, there is this thing, okay, it's called energy services, which is what we actually need to power our lifestyles. And, and it's just, I don't know, how can I put it? It's just complicated, because it actually maps onto something which engineers will all understand and be happy with, which is exergy. If we could start if our utilities sent us an exergy bill instead of an energy bill, then maybe we'd be in a much better place for, intuitively undertaking exergy efficiency moves. But I think that's a bit of a push. We're just going to have to work on educating people.
Yeah, and I do encourage folks, whether they're on Blue Sky or on X, to follow you there to get deeper on some of these questions. You've talked about these metrics. They're all the flaws and merits a lot there. There are a couple more questions and comments that I thought I'd throw past you. Douglas Allen on Facebook notes, UK's transition from coal to wood chips from the Carolina forests where I live does not decrease emissions, energy costs, or pollution. There's lots of questions about how to measure things there, but some of the UK's transition is certainly gas played a huge role in the post-coal era too, right?
Yes, I mean, just in terms of our coal going from 42% to zero, gas increased during that period, but not by as much, and emissions most certainly came down. But Douglas, that burning wood chips, I don't actually care about the wood chips. I care about if it's forests. I mean, there is waste from wood processing, and if it's truly waste that we use, then I'm kind of, then I think we have to be okay with it. Particularly if we take the next step and start capturing CO2. But of course, that's not, the Drax, that company has been caught a number of times, not really assuring its supply chain and burning whole trees and so on. And, there's always a good excuse. They most recently got fined, I think, £25 million. That is a very troubled business model, unless it's done right. But most of what we're doing in the UK, let's be absolutely clear, is actually wind, and especially coming down the track, huge amounts of offshore wind. And we're also doing some solar, and we do nuclear. And I'm an investor in a cable from Morocco that will bring non-correlated, very cheap wind and solar into the country. Hopefully we'll get all of the permits and get that done. And that will be something like 7 or 8% of the UK's electricity. So, you can focus on the one thing that's just, not right and not working, or take the picture as a whole. It's not as bad as you say.
Yeah, no, I would love to learn. Actually, I should have asked you what you're invested in, because that's a reflection of what in for you is the real prospects going forward. Maybe we can do another show along those lines. But Robert Quigley talks about China. He says, China's installed more solar in 2024 than the rest of the world combined. They've done it for many years, kind of like what you were saying with their success on EVs. And I remember there used to be this. It was said that Tom Friedman once said that it would be great to be China for a day, but apparently he never actually said that. But I think a lot of climate people have that in their heads sometimes, that it wouldn't be good to be like China. And also they're opening a lot of coal plants. What's your take on how we think about China going forward?
Well, so I wouldn't like to be China even for a day.
Yeah.
Those people who say it, they tend to kind of say, well, what they would like to have is the sort of the speed of decision making in order to deal with the climate environment. And if you wish for that, you might get the opposite, which is the speed of decision making that decides to go off and do something that's not your favorite issue. I think China, first of all, you can't say China wants this, China wants that. It's a very complex society, and there are different players within it. There are players within it. I had Dr. Ma Jun, who's a member of the policy of the rate-setting body of the People's Bank of China on cleaning up, and he's one of the fathers of sustainable finance across the world globally. But mainly, I think a lot of, not mainly maybe, but a lot of what they have done in building that ferocious solar industry and battery and electric vehicle industry has actually been driven by industrial policy and the understanding that they can't dominate the world in internal combustion vehicles, but they can and are becoming a dominant force in sort of all of the clean technologies. A recent episode of Cleaning Up, Bryony Worthington and I talked about the direction that the US has chosen to take versus China as being petrostate versus electrostate. And I think that's a really interesting framing, because clearly we've got the drill baby drill, the facilitating of more fossil extraction, potentially a rethinking of the IRA mechanisms for clean energy, and also the use of LNG around the world as a vehicle, as a tool of foreign policy, providing cheap LNG or withholding it as a way of achieving goals, geopolitical goals. US.
Yeah.
In China, what you've got is, very interestingly, if you look at the rate of electrification of Europe and the US, it grew from the 1970s to about 2010 from 10% to 20%, but it stalled. We're actually not electrifying. We are electrifying some of our transport and some things, but we're also switching to LEDs and becoming more efficient. So net, electricity is flat. In China, it's just gone straight through the 20% mark, later than us in Europe and the US, but it's continuing going, driven partly by the fact they don't want to import fossil fuels. They don't have oil, they don't have gas, they have lots of coal. Right. So China is domestically, for its balance of payment, for its industrial policy, it's electrifying, and it's going to be using its batteries and solar and high voltage DC technology and so on as a tool of geopolitical influence. So there's a really interesting juxtaposition of the petrostate versus the electrostate. And of course, then the question is, well, where is Europe on this? And, I think Europe is the kind of luxury goods, handbags, and cathedrals state. We don't seem to have a response to that dynamic of US-China competition with their different strategies. We're a little bit becalmed between the two, if I'm honest.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think there's been some cogitation around that lately, and Trump will be forging ahead with a U.S. first Gulf of America, Greenland acquisition kind of dynamic that's going to make this interesting.
Look at today's announcement, which is, I think, $100 billion infrastructure for AI data centers. And Europe, meanwhile, is trying to figure out how to regulate AI data centers. Do we force them to be energy efficient and use the waste heat for CHP? And how do we make sure that AI doesn't, do nasty things? And let's make sure that there are no unintended consequences, and the precautionary principle. Sadly, we're just not going to be moving at the speed required to stay relevant.
Yeah. There's one thing in your piece on AI that I thought was very interesting. I put on my blog this morning about your hope that these giant information industry companies realize that the merits of working with the grid, the wider grid, and with the communities in the regions they're developing these their data centers in is the way to go forward. Not to think about it's like buying a generator and sticking it outside your house. That model is not going to work well at this scale.
So within these tech titans, there have been teams working for a decade and more on energy, and they've done huge numbers of power purchase agreements for clean energy. And they've got these very ambitious targets and concrete plans to get to them. So I don't want to portray them as neophytes, but the people at the top, the real tech titans, actually have only woken up to the energy challenges very recently. The Zuckerbergs, the Sam Altmans, even to a certain extent, I think, Elon Musk, have really only suddenly realized that when you need a gigawatt, 2 gigawatts of dispatchable power in location X quickly, as in within 1, 2, 3 years, that's a really ferocious challenge. That's like building a new aluminium smelter in Northern Virginia and suddenly, finding enough energy for it. And so it's not surprising that they're reaching for easy answers. The easy answers are nuclear because they're tech bros. They understand, they have great faith in tech. So nuclear looks attractive, also because it's dispatchable. And behind the meter, so let's just build our own stuff. Let's be off grid. Grid is complicated. Public utility commissions are complicated. Everything's complicated. Let's do the simple and the quick thing. And by the way, if you can get away with it, the simplest and quickest thing is actually gas, because the gas is there and it's reliable and it's not very expensive. And the only downside is this emission stuff, which I don't even know to what extent they believe is a problem. I think they will find the same, and by the way, that they will do a bunch of that. They will find that the gas is quick, but the societal pressure will mount because of that, because of the emissions and the pollution, the air quality issues. They will find that nuclear is a whole hell of a lot harder than they think. If it was easy, utilities would have been doing it. We'd have been doing it, a lot, and we're not. It's hard work doing nuclear. And they will also discover that just trying to control your environment and do everything behind the meter is actually going to alienate communities. It's not the way to do it because it'll be expensive. And you're losing the opportunity to say to a community, look, we're providing a lot of investment, a lot of jobs, and our energy system can play a positive role in providing resilient and clean energy to this community. Let's work together. Utilities have been doing this for 150 years.
Right.
That you can't just impose solutions on people, particularly where there are net negatives. If it's behind the meter, you just have to build, multiple redundancy and you can keep the system going. That's fine, but very expensive. So then you say, well, we'll connect to the grid, but only for backup, just in case our thing falls over. Well, guess what?
Right.
Then the Public Utility Commission or the network operator will be saying, well, hang on a second, you're telling me that you're going to suddenly come in and require 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatts of electricity. Who's supposed to meet the cost of that? So I think there's going to have to be a lot more, how can I put it? Stakeholder engagement, the design of systems that are resilient. Complexity on the energy side may be, but I hope we'll get to a better place as a result of that. I'd like that process to be short-circuited so that it happens quickly, because the benefits of AI are very, very considerable.
Is there a chance that they can end up doing what Apple did when it moved from being whatever it was at the beginning to being a music company and everything else? Are these AI, the pulse of their need for energy, can that drive innovation that gives them ultimately something to sell more widely? I'm just thinking out loud here right now, could they end up being something more than thinking of themselves as information and solution companies?
I mean, that's a huge question, which involves, to what extent might the AI also be useful in managing the grid and so on. I think that one thing that we can say is it's kind of useful to have the richest companies in the world actually thinking about how do we get dispatchable clean electricity.
Bingo, exactly.
Right? They've got so much money, and that's the problem they want to solve. Well, that's good, because I tell you what, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years ago, the richest companies in the world were not worrying about that. Some of the most stressed balance sheets in the world were worrying about that. Now, they've rushed off and said, and the answer is nuclear. I actually think, and some of them have said it might be geothermal and there's some small deals. I actually think that, first of all, they'll find it a lot easier to do geothermal than nuclear. I've been an advisor to a geothermal company called Ever. I'm pretty sure they'd be more than happy, and are, in fact, having conversations. But they will also discover that, do you know what? Hybridizing wind, solar, batteries with some backup, maybe even some hydrogen, some longer distance connections, investing in the grid, actually ends up being not just more resilient, well, not just cheaper, but also more resilient and more socially resilient. So they could pull through some of those technologies and some of those solutions. Might some of them be nuclear? Yes, I hope so. I have a nuclear engineering background, but I think it'll happen anyway. So yeah, I think there's some positive spin outs from what they're doing. Will they control them? Will they benefit? I don't know. I think they would probably make more money from the services that help us optimize the grid, the services that help us, for instance, get more electricity through a transmission line where AI can really help.
Yeah, I think that all sounds pretty, that sounds like a good picture to me, actually. And just what you said about the richest companies in the world thinking about energy services and reliability is a key. I think that's a keystone to potential big progress ahead.
Andy, if I might, I want to give a plug because you've put up, you gave me the plug. Generative AI, the power and the glory. That's a piece I wrote for Bloomberg New Energy Finance. I still write for them twice a year. It's a deep dive. It's long. It's 7,000 words. You're very kind to have referred to it and put it on the screen here. Bloomberg lets me do an audio version for my podcast for cleaning up, and it actually goes out this evening. In fact, it's going out in I think 1 hour. And here's the thing. I'm not reading it. I'm not sure if I should tell the audience. I should let them discover for themselves. It's actually going out, and it seems like I'm reading it, but I'm not.
And you've been trained.
AI is a wonderful, wonderful, multifaceted thing that's going to change all of our ways of working. So, to the audience, if you're intrigued, it's called Cleaning Up, and you can find it on your podcast or on YouTube.
Oh boy. Well, this has been a great conversation, and maybe one of many going forward. What I like about the live versions of what we do here is that you're engaging with audiences in real time, and I think that's kind of why I do what I do this way. Michael Liebreich, it's good to get to know you better than I have, and maybe we can do this again sometime on Sustain What.
Absolutely, I'd be honored to. It's been a great conversation. Thank you, and thank you for everything you do.
Well, one can only try. I'm actually not really supposed to be working. I'm sort of retired, but I can't stop. Part of my brain, when I wake up in the morning, the way I engage with the world is through asking questions and fostering connectivity. And so it's just part of what I do. It's not like a job.
I hear you. This does not feel like work.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks again, and be well. This gets, as soon as I hit the end the stream button, anyone can share the what they've been watching with anybody else, and keep the conversation going. This is Andy Revkin's Sustain What conversation series with Michael Liebreich. Do track his cleaningup.live podcast, webcast, and his writing for Bloomberg and everything else he does. And be well and be hopeful. And hope is a verb. Get active, especially in the United States facing the stormy waters ahead.